Good morning. Welcome to our presentation titled Complete Streets at Varying Scales, Challenges and Opportunities. I am Ram Madali and I'm a practice leader with the CDM Smith. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of serving as a moderator on this Complete Streets panel. I'll be introducing each of the panelists as we go through their respective slides. This panel presentation will discuss Complete Streets applications at varying scales. The discussion will define Complete Streets, discuss how Complete Streets can be applied through statewide plans and policies, demonstrate how Complete Streets are needed and applicable within both rural and urban settings, using the US 67 Corridor Master Plan in Texas as a case study, and identify national best practices and opportunities for Complete Streets. While Complete Streets are often thought of as an urban concept, they are also needed and applicable at varying scales to enable safe access for all users, including pedestrians, bicyclists, transit riders, drivers, and freight. The concept does not just focus on infrastructure, but also encompasses decision-making and a design process that balances the needs of the end users in each land use context. Providing safe and convenient bicycle and pedestrian travel options can help increase access to economic opportunity for traditionally underserved populations, including low-income, minority, older adults, and limited English proficiency populations, as well as persons with disabilities. I'm going to pass the presentation off to Steve Linhart from TechStart. He's the project development manager to give an overview of Complete Streets at the statewide scale. With that, Steve.
Thank you, Ram. The Texas Department of Transportation, or TxDOT, is the transportation agency for the state of Texas. Headquartered in the state capital of Austin and with over 10,000 employees, the department is responsible for the planning, construction, maintenance, and operation of a multimodal transportation system. Our state highway system has over 80,000 centerline miles, with a significant majority of those miles outside of cities. We have 25 district offices with oversight of 254 counties across Texas. Our mission, connecting you with Texas. Our bicycle and pedestrian program is located within our public transportation division and includes a manager and a planner. Each TxDOT district office also has a designated bicycle and pedestrian coordinator. In addition to TxDOT staff, the department has a bicycle and pedestrian advisory committee. It is comprised of 11 members appointed by the Texas Transportation Commission who serve voluntarily for a 3-year term. The advisory committee meets on a quarterly basis with the next meeting planned for this summer in July. The TxDOT Roadway Design Manual was developed by TxDOT to provide guidance in the geometric design of roadway facilities. The document is a guide containing geometric design recommendations and does not represent an absolute design requirement. Last summer, TxDOT issued a revision to the manual. The criteria contained in the manual are applicable to all classes of highways, from freeways to 2-lane roads. This roadway design manual represents a synthesis of current information and design practices related to highway design. Bicycle accommodations. The roadway design manual includes guidelines and standards for developing facilities to accommodate bicyclists. Such facilities are to be considered during the scoping process of a project and are a requirement for urban streets. The roadway design manual also includes guidelines and standards to accommodate pedestrians. Walking is an important transportation mode that needs to be incorporated into transportation planning and projects. Planning for pedestrian facilities should occur early and continuously throughout project development. Multimodal networks attract tourists, connect people to parks and other destinations, and create unique economic development opportunities in cities and towns across the state. In 2018, TxDOT completed the Bicycle Tourism Trail Study. From that study, some recommendations were made related to being included on the bicycle tourism network, including paved shoulders should be at least 8 feet wide and be provided on both sides of the roadway. Drainage grates and gutter seams should not be included in the usable width unless they are bicycle friendly, and installing bicycle route signage to guide cyclists. Last year, TxDOT's Transportation Planning and Programming Division completed its most recent statewide transportation plan, Texas Transportation Plan 2050. The plan recognizes that active transportation, including walking and biking, encourages physical activity, which has been linked to a reduction in the risk of chronic disease and healthcare costs, and improving overall human health and quality of life. TxDOT plans and programs. As noted in the Texas Transportation Plan 2050, TxDOT supports bicycle and pedestrian facility investment for local and metropolitan planning organization projects. Cities, counties, and MPOs can also propose bicycle and pedestrian projects in state right-of-way using local, state, and/or federal funds. TxDOT coordinates with these entities on project implementation and maintenance responsibilities. TxDOT uses 3 federal funding sources for bicycle and pedestrian improvements: Transportation Alternatives Program, Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Highway Safety Improvement Program. These programs are managed by the main TxDOT office headquartered in Austin in partnership with the 25 local district offices and regional and local governments. Pedestrian and bicyclist traffic fatalities have been rising along with statewide vehicle miles traveled. November 7th, 2000 is the last time there was a deathless day on Texas roads. We want to end the streak of deaths on our roads. Our goal is to reduce the number of fatalities on our roads to 0 by the year 2050. Continued investment in safe infrastructure also helps decrease motor vehicle related bicycle and pedestrian injuries and fatalities as we look to end the streak.
Thank you, Steve. So Steve provided an overview on the policies and programs at the statewide level. From that, we are going to delve a little bit more into a case study using US 67 in Texas as an implementation example. It is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Chris Weber, Alpine Area Engineer from TxDOT El Paso District. Chris?
Thank you, Ram. As Ram stated, we've recently completed a multi-year public engagement and planning effort on the US 67 corridor, which extends from the international border of Presidio, Texas and Ojinaga, Mexico, 142 miles all the way up to Interstate 10 near Fort Stockton. When we began the study, we were in an environment locally that was not necessarily public engagement friendly. There were 2 past efforts, La Entrada El Pacifico study back in 2006 to 2008, as well as a more recent Trans-Pecos pipeline that came through, and both efforts created an environment where the public especially, but some elected officials were very hesitant to any planning efforts. Again, the La Entrada El Pacifico study that was done was to sort of promote high-level international truck traffic, and really was insensitive to the needs and desires of a lot of the locals that live out here. The Trans-Pecos pipeline was a gas pipeline that utilized eminent domain, and the planning efforts of that were very quick and created a lot of discontent in the local environment here. And when we began this planning effort, despite our good intent and emphasis on safety, we had to realize that we were coming into a very difficult environment from a public engagement standpoint. So as a result of knowing that environment, we had to structure this study to be sensitive to that and make sure we were inclusive as possible as well. So of course, in the slide you see here, the public is kind of this overarching group that was included the whole time. But the way we structured the study consisted of a steering committee first and foremost, and that consisted of our 3 county judges from Pecos, Brewster, and Presidio counties, our 3 city mayors from Marfa, Presidio, and Alpine, as well as our 3 city managers and administrators. And next, and you'll see this in the next slide, we developed a corridor working group, and that was a huge group of essentially everyone we could think of with a stake in this project in terms of agencies, our nonprofit groups, local media, and some special interest groups, as well as individuals. And we also had focus group members, which were special sit-down meetings we had again, in that guise of being inclusive and engaging specific groups to make sure that maybe there were some things they wanted to share with us they weren't comfortable sharing at public meetings or in steering committee corridor working group meetings. And those focus groups consisted of our local art community, landowners and ranchers, environmental groups, and several others. This is the corridor working group that I referred to earlier. And as you can see, it's a very inclusive list, very exhaustive list consisting of local government officials, our local news media, including radio, newspaper, and television, special advocacy groups, each with their own specific interests, our state and federal government officials, our local chamber of commerce, freight interests, our independent school districts, as well as our federal partners in the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House, and on the state level, our state Senate and state House, and many others. And as you can see at the bottom of the screen, we were always constantly asking, are we missing anybody? Is there someone else, some other group we should include? And we've got some really, really good input on the front end of this study to make sure that we were extremely inclusive as we desired to be. As far as public outreach activities in this multi-year study, we conducted 3 bus tours. We had 4 brain dump workshops, 7 corridor working group meetings with the members in the slide you saw previously. We had 9 steering committee meetings and a grand total of 12 public meetings in 3 series in 4 different locations. As far as who attended, the bus tours were very interesting. I think we kind of made the internal comment that after the first bus tour, like, wow, that we just held an 8-hour long public meeting and no one could leave because the door was shut. It was really engaging. We've got a lot of really interesting input from our stakeholders that attended, from our elected officials that were our tour guides along the corridor, pointing out some specific local interests as well as concerns they had along the corridor. And we got some really interesting input from representatives from the different agencies and organizations that attended that with us. To be honest with you, I was a little hesitant. You know, a bus tour. I'm an engineer. You know, what are we going to do? Drive around the corridor? What are we going to talk about? How is that going to work? But it really was a very unique and inclusive experience. It gave us the opportunity to build relationships, again, talk with each other and gather meaningful input from our stakeholders, and not necessarily traditional input. We had some input from a Border Patrol agent, for instance, that was talking about the need for more signs related to existing passing lanes we had. I mean, just really unique input, and not necessarily everyone sitting in their box and only providing input in their wheelhouse or in their immediate area of influence. It gave us an opportunity to not only inform, but identify some of our study champions, the people that were more passionate and just genuinely interested about this effort. So that was a really nice outcome. Gave us the opportunity to discuss location-specific concerns that folks had, and we did notice a lot of common location-specific concerns, which was, again, a very interesting outcome. Also allowed us to identify specific community concerns, and overall provided a neat environment for a very collaborative discussion, and also the opportunity to brainstorm some possible solutions. We also used a couple of new to me and new to most online tools. Again, this was all pre-COVID, but really set the stage nicely for including people and trying to garner their input regardless of whether they were able to juggle their schedules and attend certain public meetings. It was a really neat way for folks to participate and just provide multiple avenues for them to participate. The first, was sort of an online tool that they could sign up with their email or Facebook and provide formal public comment there. The second, planning tool that we made available online, they could access in a GIS environment accident data, speed limit data, kind of go more into, instead of just the general comments like that first online engagement tool that we used, this one allowed them, if they chose, to really drill in and look at some of the location specific or corridor specific data that we had. And some folks choose to use that and some didn't, but again, it was available for those that showed interest. Another really neat thing that would seem very traditional now, in the COVID environment, but we early on identified the need for a virtual public meeting, so that if you were unable to attend one meeting or another, again, there were 3 in series at 4 different locations, but even if you weren't able to juggle your schedule and attend those public meetings, these virtual public meetings allowed folks to attend. They could have been in Germany on vacation and not been able to attend a public meeting and still play catch up and say, okay, I want to see the presentations that were given. I want to see videos of the presentation that was given. I want to see all the boards that were up in that room. And this virtual public meeting, which is still available today, allowed people to go through exhibit by exhibit and see everything in the room just as they were there in person, but in a virtual environment. And, it was pre-COVID, but it was again an attempt to be as inclusive as possible and share this information with anyone that showed interest. Another really neat thing that happened with these virtual public meetings is it allowed anyone, I've used them, to go back to, maybe we were in the process of planning for the second or third public meetings, and there was something I wanted to go back and look at. I used this tool to go back and look at the first public meeting or the second public meeting and be able to call up those exhibits very quickly. So it was a really interesting tool to be able to utilize. I'd never been, a part of something like that before where that tool was utilized. But again, from an inclusive standpoint and an engagement standpoint, it was really an awesome thing to be a part of and to be able to provide for the public. As far as our quantitative output outputs in terms of engagement, we had over 2,100 website views. The virtual house we just talked about, there were 467 virtual open house views. We had 875 people that attended in person the public meetings, and over 272,000 social media views. And in an area where you only have a population of about 32,000, that's a pretty high level of engagement in terms of participation for the public. And, you know, that was really telling. And again, using this broad approach, multiple techniques, we were able to try to capture as much public comment as possible. We received over 900 written comments and survey comments during those public meetings. And we were able to work with our stakeholders and partners to establish 12 study goals, and they were allowed to be ranked by the public. And we did see a lot of consensus as we were going through that process. And that really helped us understand that, hey, you know, safety is really important, mobility is really important, allowed us to make sure that our thoughts of what the important parts of this study were in line with our stakeholders. And that was very, very important early on in the study process. The three pictures you see here describe we kind of internally call the low-hanging fruit. These are ideas that were born. I mentioned the first one there you see on the left. I mean, that idea came from a Border Patrol agent who was driving along, or as we were driving along in a bus tour, and said, hey, you know, maybe people would not take such risk in passing each other in a no passing lane if you just put some signs up that said, hey, you got another passing opportunity coming up in a passing lane in 2 miles. And we were able to, since that idea was not controversial, seemed very appropriate to the function of the highway, we were able to work with our local maintenance folks and get those signs ordered and get them installed. And we didn't have to wait for some completion of the study and something to be published. It was just a good idea. We implemented it. There in the middle picture, again, this was something identified in discussions through our stakeholder meetings as well as on the bus tours. There were some areas that folks like to stop and take pictures of, kind of scenic areas. One we call the Profile of Lincoln, which if you come down here, I'll show it to you, but it's basically a mountain that looks like Lincoln's head kind of laying down on its side. And another one called Elephant Rock, a rock that looks like an elephant. And lots of people stopped there, and they didn't do so in the safest manner because there was not a safe area provided for them to stop and take the pictures they wanted to. So again, we worked with our local maintenance folks, our TxDOT maintenance folks, and created some paved turnouts so that, you know, we put them in locations where they could still achieve the goal of taking those pictures that they wanted, but it was, we considered sight distance, and we considered them pulling back out on the highway, and we deliberately chose those areas so that they could do so safely. In that third and final picture on the right, this was another topic that came up early on in not only in the bus tours, but in some of our initial conversations with stakeholders. And there's a really wide section of pavement there in Marfa, and people were kind of taking upon themselves to make that a 2-lane facility instead of a 1-lane facility. So again, we worked with our local TxDOT maintenance folks. We added some additional striping, and we had some accidents in that location due to some turning trucks and, you know, people just not understanding the rules of the road. And it worked really well. We haven't had any complaints or concerns or accidents since we were able to implement that. So again, three ideas that were born outside of TxDOT, but inside this planning effort, that were such good ideas and so non-controversial and frankly kind of obvious solutions. We just went ahead and implemented them as soon as possible. And thanks to our local TxDOT maintenance folks, they were able to do those quickly. And above all, this, you know, we talked about on that previous slide where we weren't coming into the most friendly environment in terms of public involvement efforts or public engagement efforts. And this really, in my mind, turned the tide. You know, instead of listening to what we do, watch what we do. You know, these small, seemingly small 3 efforts, people heard those ideas thrown out there by non-TxDOT employees, by non-study whether it be CDM Smith or TxDOT, these ideas came from the public, and we implemented them. And I think it went a long way. I know it went a long way to build trust that we believe in this process and you can believe in it too. And here are some early outcomes in terms of some quick wins and low cost solutions that we were able to implement very quickly and early on in the study process, and went a long way to demonstrate that it's okay to trust this process. And if you think this is cool what we did here, wait till we get to the final plan and start implementing some of those solutions that we've heard concerns about.
Thank you, Chris. With that, we got a great overview from Chris on the US 67 corridor study. We're going to go more into details on complete streets, and I would like to introduce my colleague, Robbie Gutat, a transportation planner at CDM Smith, to talk about specific rural and urban case study examples of US 67. Robbie?
Thanks, Ram. So where Chris left off on the US 67 case study, describing those low-hanging fruit, those projects that the public identified and TxDOT was able to quickly implement, I'm going to continue in providing an overview of the complete streets recommendations that the US 67 Corridor Master Plan developed. So taking it a few steps back, I'll begin by describing the role of the US 67 Corridor Master Plan. We started the planning process by identifying the needs of the corridor. As Chris described earlier, a lot of those needs were identified through the public input process and through engagement of local officials and stakeholders. In addition, a significant data collection and analysis process helped identify the needs of the corridor. The Corridor Master Plan serves to document those identified needs and recommend solutions to those needs. It also identifies potential funding sources that could possibly be pursued to fund and implement recommendations of our plan. And when those funding sources are ultimately obtained, those projects can be developed at a greater design detail based on the recommendations from the plan. And through the project design process, solutions to those needs are implemented through projects. The US 67 Corridor Master Plan took a publicly driven planning approach. Needs identified through the public engagement process were paired with improvements to serve as solutions to those needs, as shown in the graphic on screen. Concern for safety and mobility for pedestrians and bicyclists were expressed during every step of the public involvement process. This increased demand led to a complete streets approach within our plan. And besides the overwhelming public demand that we received to consider complete streets options, the makeup of the communities themselves would benefit from more non-motorized options. As shown in the graphs, there are high poverty levels, a relatively low automobile ownership level, making pedestrian and bicycle improvements a good fit for the communities. In addition, tourism is the third largest employment cluster within the region. The cities of Alpine, Marfa, and Presidio along the corridor really cater to that tourism industry for nearby recreational amenities, including parks like Big Bend National Park and art attractions like the Chinati Foundation in Marfa. During the planning process for developing complete streets options, we applied the use of the HoloLens. If you're not familiar, the HoloLens is a pair of mixed reality smart glasses that are developed and manufactured by Microsoft. You can see a picture of me to the right of the screen wearing the HoloLens at a public outreach event. We essentially took our recommended improvements and developed them further into a 3D environment with an Autodesk product called InfraWorks. We imported that 3D environment into HoloLens, which then allowed users to literally immerse themselves into the conceptual improvements. And this tool was used for both refining conceptual improvements and as an educational tool for the public and stakeholders. We demonstrated the tool at several public engagement activities to allow the public and stakeholders the opportunity to experience the conceptual improvements within the mixed reality environment. So in taking all this information we collected from the public, our data analysis, and best practices from across the country, we developed a toolkit of different complete street solutions for the US 67 Corridor Master Plan. This toolkit essentially breaks down into urban solutions, rural solutions, and network solutions. I'll take you through a couple examples more closely in the next couple slides. So as an example of one of our recommended urban solutions, I'll show you the city of Marfa, and this is the existing corridor. Residents in Marfa especially expressed a desire for bicycle and pedestrian facilities throughout the public outreach process. The city currently lacks bicycle lanes, but the city does have a local bike share called Bike Marfa. There's also significant tourism, as mentioned a bit earlier, and it's especially present in Marfa for art attractions. And pedestrians and cyclists are a common sight on the roads, going between the different attractions. As shown on screen, the right-of-way is pretty wide, and there's a lot of space to potentially work with for enhancements to accommodate bicycle riders and pedestrians. So on screen here, this is one of our proposed urban solutions for Marfa from our toolkit. Working within the wide right-of-way, the solution includes a bicycle lane with striped buffers, a parking lane, and a sidewalk. This next slide shows a plan view of the same solution. As US 67 is a corridor that carries a high volume of freight vehicles, this view shows the separation and mixing of the modes at this key intersection. As you can see, we have the sidewalks, the bicycle lanes with the buffers, and the striping for the vehicles and freight vehicles. To develop network solutions, we wanted to understand where current demand for bicycle and pedestrian amenities existed. So without having bicycle counts for these communities, we turned to Strava. And Strava data is crowdsourced data collected from users of the Strava smartphone app. Users can utilize the app to track cycle trips, walks, and even jogs. Strava data is a useful tool for us to help identify when bicycle trips are occurring or demanded, but where that safe infrastructure might be lacking. So through our analysis of Strava data, we identified some key network links that users would benefit from safer bicycle facilities, as shown in the map. And on this slide, we show what we developed as a general cross-section within the city of Presidio as a network solution, something that could fit on most network links throughout the city. So we're showing the addition of a bicycle lane with a buffer. And throughout our public engagement process, we learned of the recreational cycling that occurs between the cities of Alpine and Marfa. Cyclists are using the existing shoulder as their path of travel. We turned to Texas guidelines to develop a recommendation for a safer facility to accommodate this recreational practice. And we recommended an enhanced shoulder that included rumble strips with gaps to allow cyclists to exit the shoulder to avoid any potential obstructions they may encounter on their path of travel. This slide shows a map of the US 67 corridor between Alpine and Marfa, where we recommended enhanced shoulders, where this recreational practice occurs. So to wrap up on the case study of the US 67 Corridor Master Plan, the plan was developed to meet the unique needs of a rural corridor out in West Texas. Through our public engagement activities, significant public feedback and demand was learned for complete streets. So as a result, we developed complete street solutions to meet these public demands for bicycle and pedestrian needs, while also balancing the needs for freight travel. TxDOT maintains guidelines and standards for bicycle and pedestrian facilities within rural contexts, and those were used to develop our solutions for the corridor. And our complete street solutions were developed for these corridor communities of Alpine, Marfa, and Presidio to provide a toolkit for future plans and future implementation opportunities.
Thank you, Robbie. We have provided an example of a case study of US 67 and how complete streets are applicable in Texas. Now we are going to step out a little bit outside of Texas and take a nationwide perspective on complete streets and some of the case studies as being presented and discussed in other parts of the country. Let me welcome Jennifer Palmer, my colleague and a senior project manager, to provide an overview of the national perspectives. Jennifer?
Thanks, Ram. And I think as we go through these national perspectives, you'll see some mirroring of some of the very great practices that were employed on US 67 and that really make a difference in successfully implementing complete street solutions. Developing complete street solutions requires a tailored approach to the context of the roadways and the surrounding land uses that you're dealing with. And this includes from large urban contexts to more suburban land use and development to smaller rural communities. And while the solutions will be tailored, the overall goal is that for any context you're dealing with you develop solutions with all travel modes considered simultaneously to create complementary travel networks that are integrated with the communities and variety of travel needs served. So in this way, complete streets can really be seen more as a process than a specific set of tools and treatments. And it needs to start from early planning levels to be truly effective. And I think we saw that exact thing with US 67. Only looking at complete streets in the context of a design process misses significant opportunities to improve the built environment in a way that develops a sense of place and can help serve people rather than any one particular mode. Effective integration of planning and engineering is needed for successful implementation of these kinds of solutions. And there are three major elements that help us to set up a project for success that we'll be briefly going over today from the national perspective, incorporating these best practices and experiences across the nation. And these involve analysis at what we'll call a program level at the very start, integrate land use and transportation goals and objectives, both existing and future focused, to develop a defensible and performance-based criteria for solution generation. At the project level, the analysis and data that help define community assets and connection needs, including examining potential for latent demands that can be helped to develop tailored block-by-block solutions, and that consider innovative solutions that may require time and education of stakeholders for buy-in, as well as identifying the low-hanging fruit like we saw with US 67 and Chris's presentation. And then finally, for all the technical analysis that you do, it's really important to bring in the stakeholder and community buy-in. We saw in US 67 a variety of tools were used to be able to solicit that input from the public and stakeholders early on. And really, there are several tools that we can use to help develop long-term, defensible, and in some cases even iterative solution development to meet project objectives. So we'll be going over each of those three during this section. So first, at a program level, one of the most important elements early on is to establish the land use and transportation context of a corridor, and starting to parse out the corridor with the understanding that there are likely multiple land use contexts, even within one corridor that you're studying, that can impact the types of solutions that are available. And these examinations need to fully consider future land uses as well as existing ones. They help to acknowledge that there's no one design that will fit all contexts early on in the process. And so one example of this, as shown on the screen at a state level, is from Florida Department of Transportation's context classification system, which has developed a methodology for looking at both land use and transportation conditions in a corridor to establish appropriate context and to consider future land use and community plans early on. These context classifications, or land use typologies, as they're often called as well, once established, can then be used to set appropriate desired functional characteristics within the corridor and design parameters that guide solution building at later stages of project development. This helps to establish at the outset design speeds and functionality considerations that are needed, as well as an array of needs based on desires within the community and from the community input that's gathered. These are just two examples of different types of land use typologies that were developed for a project in Danbury, Connecticut, with coinciding functional characteristics and design parameters for each of these. And within, as I mentioned, within each of these corridors that we're studying across the nation, we often find that there are multiple contexts, and so establishing these typologies is very important. So what do we do once we've established that land use typology or context classification? There are a number of ways to further examine the needs at a project level, but thinking programmatically at the start can help to define performance-based goals and objectives for all modes. There will ultimately be trade-offs between these modes down the road and developing appropriate solutions within available right-of-way. But this programming analysis really helps to establish the desired and needed system for each mode. First, so that solutions can be tailored to meet a variety of user needs from the very start of a project. The process, which involves basically 3 steps, helps to define at the outset how the segments function for all users. It helps establish a network-based framework for complete streets priorities, and defines early on a performance-based look at system deficiencies and needs. And these early program steps really help to develop a comprehensive and strong purpose and need for your project that can be carried through all decision making and communications with your stakeholders and the public. So as part of the first step, we further analyze and can develop a sort of tiered system of priority for each mode within a corridor and identify the importance level of each of those modes within a specific corridor. So this tiered system can be viewed through a number of different lenses and can rely heavily on available quantifiable data, as well as established priorities for the corridor at state and regional levels, as well as through local comprehensive plans for the corridor. And it also allows you to look and tier each of these modes without having to necessarily compete amongst them at this point in the process. Based on that tiered system, we can then develop desired performance metrics and even benchmarks for performance desired for each mode. These performance-based criteria should be as quantitative as possible within each mode, because it really allows you to get into the heart of trade-offs between priorities that may need to exist when you're considering comprehensive solutions. And this is really where the third step comes into play, where you're able to establish existing and future conditions for each mode by the alternatives that you've developed. You can evaluate those quantitatively between modes. So for instance, having quantitative performance measures for both automobile and transit movements can allow you to look comparatively at the changes in each mode and to weigh pros and cons of solutions. So if you're considering, say, converting a general purpose lane to a dedicated transit lane, you can start to understand the changes to expect in both transit performance and automobile performance. We did this in evaluating, for instance, transportation impacts in Seattle, where we found that the dedication of a portion of the corridor to dedicated transit lanes would help to improve transit and speed reliability by a very high percentage that we could quantify, while it would really result in 1 to 2 minutes of additional delay to general automobile traffic. So while not an apples to apples measure, this really allows for a broader perspective and look comparatively at the values of different alternatives of modes and evaluating the potential solutions. So as we think about the overall process of a project from planning to design and construction, the programming steps that were outlined help to establish an appropriate performance-based baseline for further detailed planning within a project and to develop a series of alternatives that can be vetted. And that's where project level detailed analysis comes in. What we want to avoid in projects like these of complete streets are late stage comments from your stakeholders and community members about alternatives you may have not vetted. And we also want to establish a sound basis for choosing a preferred corridor plan in case you meet any opposition along the way. Final design just isn't the place to have to backtrack and consider decision-making processes. So what does that detailed examination at the project level entail? Well, first, it means looking at a corridor in terms of its assets to the people and the destinations that are served. That can be identifying key travel markets and major activity generators, but it also involves looking at differing communities being served and further examining their culture, history, their context, all of which may ultimately feed into both development of viable solutions to connect people, but also the amenities that may need to be provided and even at even later design stages. So this may be even later on down the line, looking at the types of color palettes and materials to be considered that reflect the communities in which they serve. And these assets really establish a foundation for a sense of place for the people within a corridor. Beyond this, safety becomes paramount to each and every project and must be considered both programmatically at a system-wide network level to understand and focus and to understand and focus at the project level on locations where complete streets designs may have the greatest benefit to the users of the system and help to support Vision Zero goals. Crash analysis helps to inform where problems exist and potential ways to address these problems. And in comprehensive safety analysis and audits, you can also use tools like benefit and cost analysis to help prioritize improvements with the biggest bang for their buck. So this doesn't mean that all potential safety improvements identified aren't worthwhile and needed in a corridor, but it does recognize that cost and funding are always an issue in projects, and that you may need some short-term, mid-term, and long-term investments to fully address the array of safety and other issues in a corridor with the reality of costs in mind. Additional analysis at the project level often includes, and this is just one example of a recent project that we did in the Boston area. It looked at additional analysis for bike ped orientation, establishing an index for the corridor, the major street network, and the major intersections. Identifying and defining gaps in the network for all users. This really gets at some of the things Robbie was talking about with the strata data that they used for US 67, but can be done through other origin destination and count data that you may be able to obtain. And then further examining the ways that we can address latent demands in a corridor. So for the bike ped orientation index, in particular, analysis there factors in multiple criteria for each intersection, identifies bike and ped safety deficiencies and safety data, and establishes a scoring system on compatibility of the street and nearby intersections to accommodate bike ped travel. And this scoring, along with other bike ped origin destination assessments, helps to establish desire lines for connections and define the travel gaps. This is just one example of the I-84 corridor that we're showing for the multimodal gap analysis that was done in Connecticut. So sound design minimizes conflict points between vehicles, pedestrians, and cyclists. And treatments may need to be considered to sufficiently address these conflict points. So at intersections in particular, this is probably the most important and is often a key location where crashes are located and where solutions need to be developed in a tailored way to address these conflict points. So an array of solutions help to address these issues at intersections. Best practices involve an array of considerations for safe access of all users of the roadway. So this can include considerations where vehicular traffic calming may be needed to reduce turning speeds of cars, evaluating and developing bike and ped signal systems that provide short waiting times and sufficient crossing times, and recognize ADA challenges. Consideration at ped crossings to keep roadways and crossings perpendicular. This really helps with the cone of vision and safety issues there in their local environments, and helps to fully consider a wide range of potential solutions. So an array of solutions that that you develop at this point and at the planning process really allows you to start to consider some innovative, out-of-the-box alternative intersection improvements. And these can be more fully developed and evaluated during the planning stage. So this is the stage in the process where you can really look at significant changes to an intersection configuration and really reimagine what's possible. So FHWA has resources for many of these innovative treatments. Many departments of transportation across the nation have developed similar guidebooks on acceptable alternative intersection concepts that work and when they work, their pros and cons. And this is just one example of a town center intersection, or TCI, and really gets to the idea of being able to provide space for some of these complete streets activities and the placemaking that goes along with them. Below, you can see an example from Denver, Colorado, where this was employed close to a streetscape mall kind of area. So, you know, there are certain circumstances where this works and certain disadvantages of this in other contexts. So really considering this array of solutions early on in the process is needed to see what fits within the context of your corridor. So more complex intersections, like this one that we show from Seattle, emphasize the need for block by block solutions to be considered rather than just overall programmatic solutions. So in this example, the community was a strong bike-oriented community, and new dedicated transit lanes were also being proposed. And as you can see, this is a pretty difficult intersection to navigate for automobiles and other users of the system. So safe design that would help to minimize conflict points here were particularly challenging. But working at the block level helped to establish some really innovative solutions, like converting a previous one-way that had very low traffic volumes to a dedicated bike boulevard, while enhancing safe travel for all modes at this very complicated intersection, and making sure that we were reducing those conflict points and providing enough space in between. In addition to these types of roadway and intersection designs and overhauls that you can consider during the planning process, there are a series and there are a variation of differing traffic calming measures that may be considered at this block by block level. So this could include creating bulb outs, mid-block crossings, pedestrian refuges, and even establishing what we found to be very effective in multiple context classes, which is establishing gateways that really help to naturally cue traffic to calm and act at slower speeds. So when you look at a corridor that goes through urban and rural classifications, for instance, those gateways become really important at letting people know that they're entering a different circumstance. In addition to that, travel demand management considerations should also be considered and fully vetted at this stage of the planning process, so that you can accommodate a variety of uses and current as well as emerging technologies. So this occurs at many different levels, including working with the private sector to accommodate improvements, public-private partnerships, and public sector solutions. Comprehensive TDM solutions can not only help a corridor accommodate all users, but it really helps to leverage investments and build partnerships with unique entities. So we see this a lot in new services like mobility as a service solutions, in providing for TNCs, Uber and Lyft, in making bike share programs and integrating those with parking management systems and creating those potential solutions. And so in addition to some of these innovative and more out-of-the-box treatments, it's important at a project level to also understand the low-hanging fruit. And that is the opportunities for more incremental and cost-effective solutions that help to get early wins for a project and really build momentum for your future improvements. And we saw this in US 67. It's certainly a best practice across the nation as well. One of the key elements to consider as you're developing these conceptual engineering and design plans are the schedules for regular maintenance activities such as repaving that can be planned for the corridor and to coincide with other corridor improvements. Coinciding these improvements with the regular operating and maintenance improvement programs can allow for cost sharing opportunities and incremental solutions to build off of to get those early successes. And certainly, as Chris discussed, this really helps to build a sense of trust from the community early on. So for instance, in repaving, restriping for transit or bike usage can be considered. Extending curb cuts or creating new bulb outs may be considered in pavement improvement projects and improve ADA accessibility. We saw, of course, this in the US 67 example. We see it all across the nation that incorporating these items can really have a cumulative benefit to projects. So another example of this in a recent project, relatively recent that I worked on, was in Jacksonville, where we were looking at improving transit along a corridor within the existing right-of-way. There was some unused on-street parking, and we had done enough analysis to indicate that that was not used at key areas. As part of regular restriping, we were able to restripe that, create dedicated lanes for a portion of the corridor at no cost or very little cost to the project. So to do all of this, though, you really need the sound analysis and the tools that help to tell the story of the improvements that are being proposed. And this really helps to justify decision making, particularly when you're looking at out of the box and innovative solutions. It can really help to educate and bring on board agency stakeholders that may be reluctant to change. So both traditional traffic analysis and multimodal analysis, like micro simulation, help to allay concerns that may be raised and are an important part of being able to educate your decision makers on how improvements will actually feasibly work. So one of the tools that we've used across the country in this, and I think Robbie even mentioned it, was InfraWorks, which allows you to model out alternative conceptual engineering in a way that can be visualized in 3D, but it has interoperability with CAD programs. So this allows you to show to less technically minded stakeholders the pros and cons of solutions that are being proposed, and to be able to make modifications to your design plans rather quickly to address this input and then show them those changes in a 3D environment. But all of this technical analysis and these program and project level stages are only so good as the community buy-in that's established. US 67 showed several innovative ways that this was done, and I want to go over one example that may be of particular use in developing consensus on complete streets design issues. We all know as planners and engineers that many of the solutions we develop need to adhere to the reality of limited right-of-way and the cost of that, or just an inability to expand right-of-way due to a variety of circumstances. So getting the community and your stakeholders to understand and participate during public involvement through design charrettes, like you can see here, can be particularly effective at addressing these types of concerns and really bring an understanding from the community on the trade-offs. So there's a really neat Complete Streets game. I provided the link on this slide that's been developed, and it's available for purchase and can be used and can be used as a public involvement technique. We've also taken a similar approach and created layout plans like you can see on the right with transparencies of different types of improvements. And this really allows people to see the space that's available, the different types of improvements that are available, and to be able to make decisions within the context of that limited right-of-way. So for instance, if the community desires an on-street bicycle facility and there's currently two sides of the street that have on-street parking, there may need to be elimination of one of those sides of the street, their on-street parking to do so. This may be supported by some community members, some business community members may have concerns about it, but exercises like this really bring them into the technical decision-making process and help to evaluate what really become community-led processes of making these trade-off decisions reality. So additionally, more innovative strategies that we see across the nation can involve what's called tactical urbanism. So this is an example of such a project in Orlando, Florida, where low-cost painting and barriers could be established to provide temporary improvements that were proposed that were complete streets and orientation. And this really allowed for the public to weigh in on how these solutions worked before more costly investments were made. This project involved reducing number of lanes from 5 to 3 in a place that had a lot of safety issues, a lot of pedestrian crashes and fatalities. It also replaced those outside travel lanes with protected cycle tracks. It added a temporary mid-block crossing where, again, there were a lot of safety incidents that had been identified, and used some green paint to mark conflict points between shared uses, such as where bicyclists might be sharing the roadway with transit bus stops. Several successful outcomes were generated to help establish the benefits of these permanent solutions. Just a couple of these, we've got them all listed on the slide, but the number of vehicles traveling above the speed limit during this temporary pilot project decreased by 53%. Bicycle activity on the corridor increased by 50% with the inclusion of these new bicycle lanes, and pedestrian activity on the corridor also increased by almost 40%. We saw a lot of people utilizing the new mid-block crossing and not crossing at less safe intersections. So these types of solutions really allowed for the municipality to get information from the public on how these solutions were working. It allowed them to develop these solutions in low-cost ways at first before they made these costly investments, and they really established buy-in for recontextualizing the way in which that street network worked and also being able to convey the benefits. So in closing, I'll just say that integration is really key. The time of thinking about design as a separate process away from the planning process, or only doing a high-level sketch at the planning level, just really isn't sufficient to develop successful implementable solutions at this level. When you integrate the planning and design process in the ways that we talked about here, you help to reduce design variances that may be needed later. You reduce the schedule delays that may occur to a project and really getting it up and running. and you take the real process into consideration early on to look at opportunities, to look at the alternatives, and to not miss opportunities because they're only identified at late stages. And throughout this entire process, you're building consensus that really aids in establishing buy-in for technical decision making. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ram.
Thank you, Jennifer. So through this presentation, we looked at the statewide scale. Steve talked about complete streets from a policy and procedures from a statewide perspective. Chris and Robbie talked about complete streets using a case study, looking at the implementation at the local scale, as well as the recommendations that came out. And then Jennifer talked about the national best practices and some excellent case studies where complete streets have been planned and used. That concludes our presentation, and our email addresses are shown on this slide. Please feel free to contact us with any comments or any questions on this presentation, and we would be happy to respond. Thank you.